All right, next up is kind of the main play for today, and that's the Modernization of Standards, Processes, and Procedures Task Force. And we have Chair Greg Ford, Vice Chair Todd Lucas, and Task Force member Scott Tomaseski with a preview of the final recommendations that will be published on Monday, January 26th, and presented to the board for action on February 12th. So with that, I will kick it to Greg.
Thank you, Chair Harlow, and thanks everybody. Todd, Scott, and myself would like to, we're going to step back here and we're going to give you a good representation of what you're going to see coming out in the next release of the final recommendations that we are prepared to make to the NERC board. There's a lot in this presentation. We felt it was needed, so we're going to take the time and go through it, and I hope you can hang in there with us as we get through this. I just got to say thanks to the whole team there. I'm going to leave it at that. A lot of work has gone into this, a lot of discussion, a lot of feedback and processing of information from the stakeholders. So I hope you find these recommendations beneficial and headed in the right direction. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the milestones. The recommendations is where the meat of it's going to be, and then the next step. So let's move into that. You all know what the guiding principles were. These were the directives that we got from Chair Keenan. Hey, put something together to transform and modernize this process. Let's create efficiencies. And most of all, develop a trusted process where the stakeholder input, due process, openness, and balance of interest are there. And I hope you see that coming out in these recommendations. Let's move to the next one. So a lot of engagement that we have done in this process. Well over 50 presentations. You see the number of attendees. We've reached out to both U.S. and Canadian trades and the forums that are there. Lots of discussion with them. The regional entities have hosted events. We've had lots of interactive sessions. We could not have gotten to where we are without the input from our stakeholders. Thank you very much for that. Move to the next slide. So here we are in the timeline. October, we put out some recommendations. We held some stakeholder input forums. If you remember, one was out on the West Coast, one was on the East Coast, and you could call in or show up in person. For those, we got a lot of feedback. A lot of great discussion over the preliminary recommendations that we were headed. After those forums and input sessions, we got together in the 1st of December, had a couple of day meeting and went through every one of those and discussed options to meet those options of whether or not we should make a change. And I think you'll see the majority of that input. While all of the input, we certainly took a lot of discussion in. For various reasons, you'll see a couple of them that we just didn't feel like we needed to change the direction that we were going. That'll show up in the presentation as we go. So here we are today. We're wanting to give you a representation of what those final recommendations are. You will see this come out. It'll come out next week or so. I believe it's 26th. Some reason 29th is in my head. That may be because that's when the package is going out. But you'll see these recommendations come out. And we're trying to give you enough time so that you can digest them and also give opportunity to send comments Those comments are not going to come to us. You'll hear this again. They will not come to the task force, but they will are being solicited by the NERC board because they would like to know how the stakeholders feel about these recommendations. So let's get started. You all know as the paper comes out, our recommendations are going to be in these three areas: standard initiation, standard drafting, and balloting. We're going to go through each one of those here. So I'm not going to go specifically into each one of these, but I will talk about the paper real quick. You'll see, I think you'll see a very nice flow of this document. The way we've put together this document, there's consistency. When you read standard initiation, you're going to see a very same consistent when you go to standard drafting, and the same consistency going to balloting. You're going to see the drivers. You're going to see the stakeholder comments that we reacted to. And then you're going to see our recommendations, and then you're going to see how our recommendations addressed both the drivers and the stakeholder input. So I hope you follow that, and we think at the end of the day, the recommendations will speak for themselves, but we certainly want to hear comments, and certainly the NERC board would like to know how industry feels about these recommendations as they prepare for the actions that will be asked of them at their board meeting. So getting into these recommendations, we obviously modified a few key roles in here. The RSTC, the basic view of this is, hey, let's start with the risk report. Let's let the risk identify emerging issues. Let's let our technical committee address the technical concerns in those risks. And from those technical committees, are there recommendations for standards? We know anyone can submit a standard, but we needed to have a unified way to gather these standards and bring them in. We're using that RSTC as that funnel. So all standards will come in through there. Not all of them need to be technically vetted, but that's the place where we can start and gather the initiations of these requests of standards to come through. You'll see a little bit about what that group is going to do in the initiation process. Risk, we wanted to ask the risk committee to add oversight to this whole process. They start the ball rolling. That's how we get our emerging risk identified. So let's keep them in this process as we go all the way through, so they can have closure on the risk that they initiate all the way down to how the risk is planned to be mitigated from a NERC standpoint. That could be a NERC alert. It could be a standard. Not all issues have to be a standard, and we want to emphasize that along the way. But when they do, we want to follow this process that we're putting forward. So a lot of risk oversight. To that, to help the risk committee do that, we're going to have a risk subcommittee that is going to come out of that risk committee. They will work with a subject matter expert pool, a large dedicated technical pool of subject matter experts, to where the risk subcommittee could call on as needed, as many as will be needed, or as few as will be needed. The intent there is the risk will have the options before them to form a project team of the stakeholder SME pools as needed. It may be a formally appointed, it could be an ad hoc, hey, let's take a quick look at this. And obviously throughout this, the NERC staff has a large role in helping this process as we go along, and you'll see that as we go through all of these process statements. So with that, let's go into initiation. And Todd, if you will, I'm going to let you take over.
Greg, thank you. Let somebody give me a thumbs up just to make sure my sound's still good. Good. All right, so I'm gonna cover a little bit on standard initiation. I'll start with some of the high level stuff that has evolved over time. The last round of comments really drove us to the final recommendation. I don't know that the premise has not changed significantly as we've gone through this, but we have tuned the details. We've been after really from the beginning a streamlined and a consistent and a very predictable process. We've designed this thing around early consensus building is one of our kind of hallmarks here. And this whole initiation process, we're expecting 4 to 6 months to be able to step through that. But it includes that regular, scheduled, predictable, right now we're saying twice a year submission period, single point of entry, single way to get in the process. And we're intended to have to simplify the submission form. And you've heard us using the term SIRF or standard initiation request is intended to be a simplified, what's the problem statement that we're trying to address, is a very simple way to think about what we're looking for there to then feed into this process. We are recommending, and it is a key component of making this process work in a predictable way, is that we've got an established criteria and think in terms of like a risk model for consistent review of issues and the prioritization of those issues. And let me be clear, you're not going to see a fully developed risk model in the paper that comes out here in a few days. That is something we've still got to tackle in the implementation over what that actually looks like, but it is a key component. I think Greg mentioned this a minute ago. Part of the standardization of the process for vetting is that all of these requests will be reviewed at the RSTC for technical merit. That'll happen twice a year. In the process, y'all have also heard us talk about developing a term sheet. You start with this standard initiation request, work it through the process, and the things that are deemed worthy of a standard, then there's a term sheet developed that has more detail around the problem we're trying to solve and propose methods of solving that. And you'll see in some of the subsequent slides that term sheet is yet another opportunity for industry engagement and consensus building, because there's a comment period associated specifically with that. And you'll hear us say time and time again, it's all about early opportunities for upfront engagement and consensus building is kind of the theme of this whole process. So now I'm going to step through at a reasonably high level the steps of the process. So it all starts with submitting those standard initiation requests. And we're talking about having this process work twice a year. NERC will administer that standard initiation request process. And we've had some questions around, well, when does that period open and close and how does that work? You can think in terms of it's almost an open period all year long, but we're going to have to establish there's due dates for the first half of the process or the first submission date in the year. There'll be a date established that you stop accepting an initiation request and then you feed into the process. But you can almost think in terms of as soon as you get one date to stop accepting things, then right behind that you can start accepting and you're building the pool of SIRS for the next the next process that comes along essentially about 6 months later. So you get all the standard initiation requests together at the due date. Next step of the process is the RSTC is charged with taking all those, reviewing those requests, and recommending actions. Actions may not be go develop a standard. It may be we need to develop some guidance or a technical reference document or take some other avenue to address a risk. Some of those will be we need to go develop a standard. This warrants developing a standard. RSTC makes that initial judgment and does that in a public way and will recommend those actions and do some prioritization around those recommendations. Then there's a handoff to the risk subcommittee that we've talked about a good bit, where the risk subcommittee then is the one that will look for feedback on the recommendations coming from the RSTC. So opportunity for the industry to engage. And that's also where the subcommittee will be hosting the workshop, the standard initiation workshop that is a standard part of the process so that, again, industry can engage and advise the risk, provide feedback on RSTC said this, here's our opinion on this, and help mold where those things go. And do they really ultimately make it into the standards process? An opportunity to provide feedback on things to consider in the term sheet. So you have this workshop, and next step is then the risk has got to take all that industry feedback as well as what they started with the recommendations from the RSTC, and then they've got to develop what is the plan going forward. What things are we going to turn our attention to in terms of standard development, and are we going to hand some things back to the RSTC or some other group to take some other action on that? So the subcommittee will make a recommendation. The overall risk committee itself, RISC, will then they are the authority in the recommendation to approve those final recommendations, and then that's getting us pretty close to where we're about to hand this off. Then we'll be developing the term sheets, and the term sheets for those issues that are deemed worthy of developing a standard. And you'll hear some more discussion about stakeholder experts and the SME pool as Greg talks about standards development. But this is the first part of the process where we're really engaging those to help develop those term sheets. The NERC staff will be driving it, but they'll be using SMEs out of that subject matter expert pool to help develop the term sheet. And those term sheets will again be posted out for comments, and we're expecting industry to engage with comments. And this is your first opportunity to participate in a straw poll. You'll hear that theme riding continuing through the process as Greg talks. So that's the point you get to a term sheet, and term sheets where you start handing off to the next part of the process, which really goes into the standard development component. So I think this may be, Greg, where I'm going to hand it to you unless there's another slide behind this one. Oh, I forgot about this, fast track part of the process. So I think we've all recognized that there may be issues that arise that we need to take action outside of this very structured timeline that we've laid out, where you've got kind of two entry points about 6 months apart in the year. There could be something that comes up in the middle of that that we need to take some quicker action on and not wait for the next standard initiation request cycle to start. And we're really thinking those are going to be things that are driven by a regulatory directive or something that is identified by the NERC board as a urgent directive. But essentially, you can think about it like this: the entrance into the process is really what we're fast tracking. You almost jump to, we've got a directive from FERC. We need to convert that to a term sheet. And now we're going to turn that we're going to go through the process of developing a term sheet, get some review, and then hand it into the development process. So fast track, really, you accelerate through that initial part of the process and get pretty quickly into the development part. So that's the recommendations that you'll see at a high level in the document that's coming out here in a few days. Now I think this is where I hand it off to you, Greg.
Yeah, I'll take it. One that I see a few hands. If you all will allow us, we want to get through the entire presentation here, and then we'll take questions at the end. So don't think we're ignoring you. There's a lot of information here, and we want to make sure we have the appropriate time to go through them, and we'll handle as many questions at the end as we can. Todd, I want to just emphasize all of those term sheets, whether it's the fast track term sheet that's developed or through the process, you saw there was comment, there was a straw poll there. That's your first attempt, and Scott will talk about it a little later, but that's your first time that you can get in the ballot pool. Commenting and being a part of the process puts you into the ballot pool, and the opportunities are every time one of these areas go out for comment. If you comment, then you're in the ballot pool, and you only have to comment one time and you're in the ballot pool. It's not like you got to do it every time, but I just want to make sure it's going to be highlighted probably by me here again in our process, but then Scott will certainly highlight it again as well. So we have a term sheet, as we get in, as we get into the standard drafting changes, you see the driving changes those were the drivers that we kind of started with. These were the issues that we were working through. And you'll see on the right side there, that's where we're leaning, heading towards our recommendations. We need to have a dedicated stakeholder SME pool, and it needs to be a fairly large pool of experts that we can bring in to any standard. And certainly the idea on the standards are, if you've got a planning standard, and this is my head going this way, if you've got a planning standard, yeah, you need planning subject matter experts, but you also would be good to have the operational expert on there, or the SIP expert, and you need to bring in all functionalities of that expert pool so that you get a standard that is obviously audible, workable. The operations folks can operate to it. The planning folks can do it. So that's where we're trying to get to, is have a vast amount of expertise there that the risk subcommittee has the options to pull from, and by their decision on the how the term sheet is written, they will pull from that pool of experts that they need. Todd said it. Everything is built around early stakeholder engagement, commenting, straw polls. If we as an industry don't think something needs to be a standard, let's find out early. Let's don't waste our time trying to develop a standard that's just going to be voted down at the end of the process. Let's get that engagement early. Let's find out if we all agree the standard is the appropriate way to handle it, then we can move that thing forward. Industry comment early. Every time we put out a draft, you're going to see a comment. And there's no limit to that number. I mean, it's not like we're going to send out one, maybe 2 rounds of comments, and then it's going to balloting. If until the risk subcommittee feels that and this is why we like having the straw poll, until the straw poll gives an indication that a standard is ready for balloting, we're going to work on it. We're not going to send something to ballot that we know we shouldn't. Let me say it that way. We shouldn't send something to ballot that we know is going to fail. That just doesn't make sense. So we're going to get it through the process as many times as we need, and then get it over to balloting so that we have a process that can be successful. We define the roles a lot clearer. There was a lot of discussion around mixing of roles and not sure who does what. We feel like this process is going to really define, starting with that risk subcommittee, and knowing what the NERC role is, knowing what stakeholder SME pool and how they are going to play into it, even knowing our, as an industry, role in providing those comments. So just as Todd did, I'm going to walk us through a brief process, and it starts with that term sheet. We're going to let NERC, working with some stakeholder subject matter experts, take that term sheet and let's turn it into a draft 0. That's, you heard us say that, let's get a draft 0. Let's not have the team working for 2 or 3 months trying to come up with the first draft of this. Let's get this to a point, and let's use up-to-date tools that we have in our toolbox, and let's get a draft version there. And you'll see below that line there is, Todd has already indicated there'll be stakeholder participation options, but go to the next one. So we get that. We need to have some outreach, right? We need to understand, where are we with this? Draft 0 may be pretty good. Let's get feedback from industry. But it won't go there unless the subject matter experts feel like this is a draft that is worthy to go out and get feedback and get some technical comments on. Again, if you comment at this point, you're in the ballot pool, and we're wanting to set that up. So we got that informal outreach going, and it goes into that comment period. We post a draft. We get the straw poll going. A lot of this sounds the same. They're going to be working together on this. You'll provide those comments. You'll be put in. Fast track is going to be, at this point, you shouldn't see a difference between fast track and the normal process. Everything should be going as expected. I told you, there's not just one comment period that we're going to have. Those comment periods will come in, and the project team will analyze them. We'll take a look at it. The risk subcommittee will look at it. It may need to go back into some drafting edits. And if they do, then we'll go back through this comment period again. Again, we're trying to get the draft to a point that's ready for ballot. This process is not limited to 1 cycle. It can be 2 cycles, 3 cycles, ever how many it needs to get the draft to a point that industry is acceptable of this and provides a ready for ballot standard. And then you got the last one. You're ready for that. We will then put together the package from this drafting team. Intent is all the information, the history of everything that has gone into it, and along with the standard, and we'll be able to turn this standard over to the ballot process. And I'm going to ask Scott if you will take us through that ballot process.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to you and Todd for just leading this effort. It's a remarkable and very complicated process. So the tone and tenor of what we've been doing the last year has been really helpful, and you guys have been instrumental in making this work. As we kind of pull towards the balloting element of it, and both Greg and Todd have sort of touched on it, a lot of what makes this work is this notion of building consensus into the process. And so if you look at, the current concerns and complaints of sort of having a concern just fester until you get to a point of unloading during a ballot process, what makes this effort more effective, at least in concept, is the idea that you're building consensus and addressing concerns all along the way and providing those touch points from the beginning. As you look at the term sheet, you look at comments in terms of iterations of the ballots that are being prepared. Every one of those is increasing the likelihood of success as when we get to voting on a standard. And it's almost like a legislative type of process where you would never take something to a vote that you know is destined to fail. And so you build support for that all along the way. And if there are hiccups along the way, it gives you an opportunity to kind of step back and say, how do I address that issue, or is it not addressable? So it makes the process more effective on the back end of this. That's why when we start talking about balloting, and we'll talk about it in a second, we use the term confirmation ballot because there's an expectation that once we get there, we will be successful. And then we use the other term of extraordinary ballot, where it doesn't always happen that we're successful. And so there might be some instances where we need another vote, or we need to rethink some of this, and we may need to recalibrate or maybe reposition what we're trying to do to accomplish the end result. And so that part is extremely important. So that is sort of fundamental to the entire process. It breaks down if you cannot build consensus from beginning to end. That's just fundamental. Even with all the technical attributes, you cannot be successful without that element working. The other part here that we'll talk about, the two components, is opportunities to improve participation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The flexibility with voting and dealing with outreach, and then cleaning up the structure of the ballot body in terms of how we weight things and how those that actually do participate in the ballot make sure that their voice is heard and appropriately considered for each of the ballots that happen. So as we get into the process, ours is a little bit less complicated than what Greg had talked about with the other two areas, but the notion is straightforward in terms of, with a passing ballot, there's the confirmation ballot. We are ready to go. The project team has sort of made a determination with the risk committee and guidance that we have a pretty good likelihood of success here. It's been fed by various touch points on stakeholder participation, and we have a 30-day posting period with a balloting during 10 days of that period for standard types of ballots. If it's a fast track one, then we're talking about 10 to 15 days. So we just sort of expedite it, but the process itself is generally consistent in that respect. Then what happens after that? The ballot, theoretically should confirm consensus. We give the project team the ability to kind of deal with administrative edits if necessary, so we're not slowing down things on crossing T's and dotting I's and things like that, so we can kind of keep moving along. And then it gets presented to the board for adoption. That kind of becomes relatively straightforward in terms of how that would work with a passing ballot. So it's not really much different in terms of how it gets to the board. The expectation is that you've already addressed a lot of the things that slow down the process once you get into the balloting component, and things would generally move along. So that would be sort of the expected what you would see. Now, if you get to a point when the ballot doesn't pass, when we get into that, which is the next point that we'll try to look at here, and this is why the risk subcommittee becomes important in this. There's that strategic connection to the things that are occurring. And so the oversight and its ability to work with the project team to understand we have an issue to deal with. And so, you know, for those of us that have had that concern about, well, we just go to 321 and we're all going to be upset about it. That's not where we land here. It's now we have some options. We know we've worked through the consensus building process. There might have been something we missed in terms of the conversation. And so that under option one is sort of looking at that from a project team perspective, seeing if there's things that could be adjusted to revise the standard, having some sort of other touch points. There's options available to address that particular issue, and then get it ready for a second ballot. That's why we keep referring to it as extraordinary. We don't think we need to go there, but there are going to be some instances where, you know, there's controversy surrounding things that just may not be resolved, and we won't quite catch it in the consensus building process, but we should be closer, even with something that might be problematic. Then we get into option two, of course, which is there might be some alternative action, which actually may end up putting you in a variation of option one, but it's sort of the reference point of let's bring it back to the RSTC for more technical consideration. There may be some issue that needs some board guidance or insight, or other types of action that would feed into what the risk committee and the project team might do. So you sort of build your options and your range of options to consider, and just bring more people into that, but bring more of the policy component of it and then some of the technical considerations. And of course, option three is ending work on the standard, which may seem relatively straightforward, and there may be some reasons why that may not be quite as simple. You may end up to a technical conclusion that, well, we just can't do it. But then there's the policy overlay and other things, FERC directives and things like that, that may suggest that there might be more to the conversation than end work on the standard, but ultimately that is an option. So we have to have those types of things available. And so then, you know, where that final determination is, it may not always end in the development and approval of a standard. It may be, well, this isn't going to work like we envisioned, and now it's time to, you know, it's just like R&D. It's okay to do R&D and come up with a conclusion that that research won't result in something that actually is helpful. Not where you want to be because you spend a lot of time dealing with that, but that is sort of a reality of certain exchanges that you go through. In terms of voting rules, and this one we really listened from day one of our discussions when we were even scoping what we were going to do. This notion of restricting the ability to get into a ballot body was problematic, and we wanted to address that right up front to figure out how we can best deal with that and really provide an environment where it's inclusive rather than, well, we know our universe of people that are engaged, and that's it. We know people leave organizations, change organizations. People have different tasks and other things that change over the course of the development of a standard, and especially if you're taking a fair amount of time to figure those things out. And so we wanted to find ways to address how you could participate. And so this first component in relaxing the ballot rules was probably the most important component of that. And just saying, if you are actually actively interested in being a participant in this discussion, we just want to know that you are going to be providing some sort of input or being in a position to provide some sort of input, mostly hopefully constructive. And we looked at that from the standpoint of it's not just about the development of the standard, but it's also including commenting on the term sheet. So if you comment, as Greg said, if you comment anywhere in this process, you are now part of it. And that opens up the ballot pool to a greater universe of folks that may not be necessarily interested on day one, but they certainly are interested in the consensus building process, and you want them to be engaged in that. Then it's the internal workings of what could each organization be able to do to address how it participates, because things change, strategic plans change, staffing changes. So the notion of having one voter, one segment, sometimes that can be somewhat burdensome. So giving the ability to have the internal decisions dictate how you represent these segments that your organizations are part of, allows you to better the opportunity for people to be engaged. So you can't sit there and say, well, I only have one person to do it. Well, we've created an environment where potentially okay, well, great, we're making it easier for you to be part of that. And then of course, the third component of that is the flexibility to make changes. So it puts the ability of the industry representative to kind of identify how they can participate. And what we're doing here within the construct of this is making the opportunity possible. And then it becomes on you to figure out how you can best participate. So relaxing the voting rules without relaxing the objective, which is to provide productive feedback and then to get a real response in terms of whether industry supports it or not, is not undermined by any of the relaxation that shows up on this particular slide. Then we get into the ballot body structure. And this is an area we probably spent more time in terms of understanding what the problem was on the front end of this, and then trying to bring the guidance that was part of the 2024 RBB task force report. And if you recall, that was a board directed activity based on the 2022 recommendations when we made some of the changes to the standards process in 2022. And in that case, the board at that point said, look at the segments and let us know if there's a better way of having better representation. And so we started to look at the weightings, and we looked at how the segments are structured and what can we learn from that. And there were a series of 9 or 10 recommendations, and what you'll find in here is many of those recommendations fit really well within the work that we were doing within the task force here. And so we look to see how we can incorporate many of those recommendations, and to the extent that there might have been some things that were a little bit different, to kind of tweak it a little bit. But as we walk across this, what we got out of that was the importance of the ISO RTO role and their vital role in dealing with system reliability, and the fact that the voting is tied to this weighting structure that puts them in a position where they don't have a proportional weight to the rest of the segments in the industry, which we thought that was kind of a no-brainer. It was just sort of a numerical disconnect in terms of how you do appropriate weighting. And so one of the recommendations that came out of the task force report in 2024 fit really well within segment 2. And so that was part 1. We look at combining the large and the small electricity end users into one segment. And this is in today's environment, we have less than 10 entities that are part of those segments. And so the weighting of that becomes problematic. And so what we were looking at is, we know that there may be a universe where this grows significantly in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, we have an environment where we want to make sure the weighting that comes out of the segment becomes more consistent with what you would expect to have when you look across the entire segment. So combining those two seemed to make sense to us as a group. The consolidation of the electricity brokers and aggregators and marketers into the electric generators, that also seemed to make sense to us, just in terms of there were so many members in segment 6 that are basically spread out across the rest of the segment membership. And so again, it's trying to make sure that we have proportional weighting for those that are participating, but not disproportional influence in terms of how that plays out. And of course, some of the comments that we received within the draft recommendation provided us some additional guidance that we responded to, and I'll get to that in just a second. Same thing with revising segment 9, which is basically provincial and federal, state, and government entities, looking at how that is set up, and then of course retiring segment 10, which is basically removing the regional entities from the RBB. It's kind of like the people that are on the dais making the ultimate decisions. It's great to get their feedback, but in terms of voting from an industry perspective, it was sort of envisioned that may create some interesting conflicts and things like that. So in looking at these structural changes, there were a couple things that came up in the early portions of the recommendation. So we had two things that were really in play that got a lot of feedback during the in-person discussions. And I can't emphasize the importance of those in-person discussions that we had in November. They were robust, they were compelling, and they provided an opportunity for industry to really focus in on elaborating to what was provided in written comments. And that provided an incredibly important amount of context for us to kind of say, okay, now I really get what that means, as opposed to, well, I just read it as one of 69 sets of comments. Comments are great, but sometimes elaboration is needed. In this particular instance, we had, there was a recommendation to combine the load serving entities and the transmission dependent utilities. And so a lot of conversation came out of that, and the task force made some changes based on that. There was also some comments we received related from the consumer advocates about that combining of large and small electricity users into one segment. And where we landed on that was, at least in terms of where we are today, the representation of those segments are still relatively small within the ERO space. So as much as we understand its importance, at this point, we decided not to do anything above and beyond what we are proposing to consolidate, combining segments 7 and 8. So we really did take into consideration not only the things that were provided in this task force report, which was an industry-driven series of recommendations that then actually helped us. We also added into making sure we really got it right from beginning to end. So just making sure that we weren't missing anything, and just a really important consideration. And that's why this process of outreach has just been so instrumental. I have probably 2 more slides, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Greg. Just other recommendations, just in terms of outreach, and you know, referencing it to the compliance registry numbers, just to make sure everyone is actually an active player and actually registered within the ERO. The other 2 on the right are important in the sense of, even with these changes to the ballot body, and even with the directive that occurred in 2022 to review the composition of the registered ballot body, it is really good government to kind of periodically look at these things and to make sure that you're not missing something, or something has emerged within your business model where things may be different, because we are still in the process of encouraging industry feedback. That partnership with NERC, and by extension with FERC, that is an important relationship that makes this ERO work. And so to the extent that things change, different registers enter the marketplace, there's different participation patterns. We don't want to just sit there and say, well, we've figured it out and nothing ever changes and this is the best we're ever going to get. We need to continue to keep asking us if we've got the right equation here in terms of expectations, participation, and then information sharing that actually helps us and helps you and the board make the best possible decision. Because ultimately that's what this is all about. It's like, we inform your decision making, and we need to make sure that that decision making has the best information available. 1 more slide, and then I will go to, well, 2 more actually. I take it back. I've misled you. This is basically the distinction then between the current and the recommended ballot structure, and it basically represents the compressing of certain ballot bodies, just as I've talked through it. And then what you'll see in the report is you'll understand how the users and the number of users within these categories fit in, and you'll see how the weightings change a little bit. So again, it's all tied to making sure that what you see on the right side of that table, each one of those groups has an appropriate level of weighting, so that we're not sitting there and saying one element is basically controlling it. It is an industry-led thing, so you have to make sure that industry is actually providing that context and participation and feedback. So we don't want to rely on one segment. Now I'll go to my last slide. I think I promise. And this is all about metrics. And as we know, The metrics related to this particular exercise and what we hopefully will get to implement with board direction and approval is this notion of what did we try to accomplish with this process? So our metrics have to answer those questions. One thing we're not answering necessarily, but it's a longer question, is sort of the effectiveness of particular standards. That's a different conversation. This is focusing on, have we improved the efficiency of how we go from beginning to end? And the other element of it is that if you agree with the concept of consensus building, by definition, that should improve the value of the final ballot, the final standard you get out of this, or whatever pathway the board ultimately decides to go if we don't go down the standards path. But it's intended to be informative, and it's intended to make the best use of our collective time, especially when things are changing so quickly. What we don't want to do is we don't want to fall victim to saying, well, we're just going to go ahead and move this through because we have to. We want to make sure we're moving it through in conjunction with moving it through in the best possible way. So we're optimizing a decision point while we're speeding up this process. These metrics should hopefully be developed so that we can test that hypothesis. With that, I will turn it over to Greg to bring us home and go to questions.
All right. Before I go into that, we went through that pretty quick. I want to back up and make a couple of clarifying things that we kind of skipped over accidentally. And one is, let's talk about the risk subcommittee again. You know, our original recommendation was 15 members of the risk committee come in and form this risk subcommittee. A lot of discussion, a lot of stakeholder feedback on that. All very good points. And when we got together in December, we said, hey, you know, these are valid points. And while we still think a 15 member subcommittee is right, we're recommending that 11 of those positions be sector elected. So each of the sectors will be able to elect one member to go on to this risk subcommittee. We're asking the risk committee to then have the option, I'll say, to fill 4 of those positions. The one thing that we are asking is that 2 of those positions, people coming from the risk committee down to the risk subcommittee, will fill the role of chair and vice chair of the risk subcommittee. The other 2 can be kind of at-large risk committee members, or if the risk has other people that they would like to recommend that has the risk background, that would be them. We're trying to give the risk committee that flexibility to fill those, at least those 2 ad hoc seats, if you will. But the biggest change is, and I want to make sure everybody knows, we're recommending that each sector elect a representative from their sector to fill that role in a subcommittee expectation. Along with that, we're also trying to build in a lot of flexibility for the risk subcommittee to make decisions. One of the things that we saw was, once a standard gets put in a standard path, there's really no way out for that standard. If things changed, if the environment changed, you know, something could come up and, you know, we really don't need a standard anymore. Maybe we can make it a technical paper. We're giving that risk subcommittee now the ability to make changes as we go down this path. So trying to build some flexibility into it. You've heard Scott talk about it, and certainly on the metrics, we'll be monitoring that and be able to see how it goes. As far as next steps, here we are today. We wanted to give you a good overview of what you're going to see in the papers that's coming out. January 26th is probably the date that you'll see that come out, but it'll be sometime between that period there. We want to make sure the paper's right, all the links are correct, everything about it is there. But the big thing about it is once you get that, we want to make sure you have the opportunity to submit feedback, but specifically feedback to the board. They would like to have those comments to them by February 5th, so they can have enough time to read through them and digest them. We'll be doing a subset of this at the MRC meeting so that we can have a good open discussion at the MRC based on the final recommendations and have that discussion. And of course, after that, on the 12th, the board will be asked to take appropriate actions based on their view of the input from you all, as well as the recommendations from us. Let's make an assumption that the board approves it and we move forward to implementation. That's where we get started now from now, most likely through the end of the year. We got to change rules of procedures, standard process manual, committee charters need to be worked on. And NERC is going to be leading this. A lot of work to be done there. A lot of opportunity for us, I'm sure, as we go through this process to input. But the focus is going to be on starting with that rules of process and then move forward on that as we go through the year. Not, people have asked me, how long do I think this will take? I'm seeing the whole year of 2026 to get this in place. May be done quicker, hopefully not too much longer after that, but then we can get a good fresh start in 2027. Again, making the assumption the board agrees with the recommendations that we have. Next slide, I think might be, here's what to expect. Final recommendations paper. That'll come out, again, very informative. I think you'll find it very easy to read as you go through it, very consistent from chapter to chapter. We're going to give you a summary of recommendations, much like the monthly update that we send out. We'll have that summary of recommendations that will go out to it. But we're also going to make sure you have a very detailed and easy to read process map for those of us, myself included, who like to read through the process maps because that speaks to me sometimes more than the words on the paper. But the paper you're going to see is outstanding. I can't compliment all of the writers and reviewers of the paper enough. And I think you're going to find it very, very easy to read and very informative.